On the 27th of May, 1843, a Scottish clockmaker named Alexander Bain filed British patent number 9745 in London for a machine that could copy a document and send it through a wire. The telephone would not exist for another 33 years. Yet in 2026, nearly 2 centuries after that patent, fax machines still hum in hospitals, courtrooms, and government offices on every continent. Every generation has declared this technology dead. Not one of them has been right. Bain's workshop sat on Hanover Street in the Clerkenwell district, where watchmakers and instrument builders crowded the lanes. The device he described in his patent used 2 pendulums, synchronized by the clock mechanisms he had spent his life perfecting, to sweep a stylus across raised metal type set into an insulating surface. As the stylus crossed each line, contact with the metal closed a circuit and sent a pulse down a telegraph wire to a second pendulum at the receiving end, where the current left a dark mark on chemically treated paper. Line by line, swing by swing, a copy of the original assembled itself at a distance. Bain called it an electric printing telegraph. Nobody called it a fax. That word would not arrive for decades. But the principle was already complete, conceived by a man who repaired clocks for a living in a city that had not yet seen an electric light. The question is how a technology born before the Civil War, before the light bulb, before the automobile, ended up surviving the internet, the smartphone, and the cloud. That question starts in a world where the fastest a page could travel was the speed of the horse carrying it. You are watching Digital Relics, where we trace the machines that reshaped everyday life all the way back to the first crude version and the people who built it. If that's your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because the beginning of this one is older than the telephone, and the ending has not been written yet. Before Bain's pendulum swung, sending a document meant copying it by hand or trusting it to a courier. A contract signed in London reached New York in roughly 2 weeks, weather permitting, and there was no way to verify a signature without sending the original paper. Banks relied on personal messengers. Merchants kept duplicate ledgers in separate cities, updated months apart. A factory fire, a shipwreck, a sudden death could change everything, and the people who needed to know would not learn of it until long after the consequences had settled. The telegraph, arriving in the 1840s alongside Bain's patent, solved the problem of speed, but not the problem of form. Samuel Morse's device could send words, tapped out 1 letter at a time by an operator who translated each character into a pattern of dots and dashes. It could not send a drawing, it could not send a signature, it could not send a diagram, a map, a handwritten note in the author's own hand. A telegraph operator in Liverpool could tap out that a contract had been signed. But the contract itself, the ink, the specific clauses, still had to travel by mail. The gap between knowing something had happened and holding the proof of it was measured in days, sometimes weeks. For newspapers, the gap was worse. A photograph taken at a disaster in San Francisco reached editors in New York by train or chartered aircraft. 85 hours was common. By the time the image arrived, the story was old. News agencies hired relay riders and maintained courier networks, whose sole purpose was racing photographs from one city to another, trying to make a morning edition that was already a day behind. This was the world the fax machine was built to fix. Not the world of voices, which the telephone would eventually handle, but the world of documents, the signed contract, the engineering blueprint, the photograph of a face, the prescription written in a doctor's hand. Everything that mattered, not just for what it said, but for how it looked when it said it. Bain understood this before most of his contemporaries understood electricity. He did not try to send words faster, he tried to send the page itself. But building a machine that actually worked would take others entirely. And the question of who truly invented the fax machine is less simple than the patent record suggests. The story everyone tells is that Alexander Bain invented the fax machine in 1843. The documented record is thinner. Bain filed the patent and demonstrated the principle, proved that synchronized pendulums could scan and reproduce a pattern, but he never built a machine that could reliably copy a document for commercial use. His device remained a laboratory proof of concept. In 1848, 5 years after Bain's filing, an English physicist named Frederick Bakewell replaced the flat scanning bed with a rotating cylinder, wrapping the message around a drum and spinning it under the stylus. The improvement was significant enough that Bakewell demonstrated his version at the Great Exhibition in the Crystal Palace in 1851. Visitors watched as crude images appeared on paper at the far end of a wire. The press reported it as a novelty. Nobody ordered one. The man who turned the novelty into something the world could actually use was Giovanni Caselli, an Italian priest and physicist from Siena. Caselli spent years refining the concept into a device he called the pantelegraph. It stood 2 meters tall, with a frame of iron and brass, and used a pendulum weighing 8 kilograms to synchronize the scanning at both ends of the line. The receiving paper was soaked in potassium ferricyanide, which darkened wherever the electric current passed through it. The result was a faithful reproduction of whatever had been written or drawn on the sending sheet, visible as dark blue marks on pale paper. On the 10th of May, 1860, Caselli demonstrated the pantelegraph for Napoleon III at Froment's workshop in Paris. The emperor secured him access to the French telegraph lines. By February of 1865, the pantelegraph was operating commercially between Paris and Lyon, transmitting handwritten messages and signatures for 20 centimes per square centimeter. A sheet measuring roughly 11 centimeters by 3, carrying about 25 handwritten words, crossed the wire in 108 seconds. The first commercial fax service in history was running 11 years before Alexander Graham Bell filed his telephone patent. So who invented the fax machine? Bain had the idea. Bakewell improved the mechanics. Caselli made it work for paying customers. Honest history holds all 3 names, and the answer depends on whether you mean the concept, the mechanism, or the service. The patent belongs to Bain. The working machine belongs to Caselli. The credit, as usual in technology, is shared whether the sharers wanted it or not. But the pantelegraph's service barely survived 5 years. The Franco-Prussian War disrupted the telegraph lines in 1870, and the machine never returned to regular commercial operation. The idea was proven. The world was not yet ready to pay for it. Alexander Bain did not live to see even Caselli's brief triumph repeated. He had accumulated some wealth from his electric clock and telegraph patents in earlier years, but poor investments stripped it away. By the 1870s, he was living on a civil list pension of £80 a year, secured by a group of sympathetic scientists, including Sir William Thomson. He died on the 2nd of January, 1877, in Kirkintilloch, Scotland, at 66 years old. The man who first imagined sending a page through a wire was buried with a clerical error on his headstone. The year of death was wrong. It was later corrected. The technology Bain had sketched kept inching forward without him. In 1880, Shelford Bidwell in England built a scanning phototelegraph that used a selenium photocell to detect light and dark areas on an image, converting the variations into electrical signals. It was the first time a facsimile device could handle a photograph rather than just raised type or drawn lines. Then, in 1902, a German physicist named Arthur Korn picked up where Bidwell left off. Working at the University of Munich, Korn developed what he called the Bild telegraph, and by 1904, he had transmitted a photograph from Munich to Nuremberg in 42 minutes. By 1907, the time was down to 12. Korn's work caught the attention of newspapers and police. In 1908, the Paris police used his Bild telegraph to transmit a photograph of a wanted criminal to London. It was the first time a fax machine played a direct role in law enforcement. By the 1920s, wire services were experimenting with photographic transmission. In 1924, Richard Ranger at RCA sent a photograph of President Calvin Coolidge from New York to London by wireless. The same year, Herbert Ives at AT&T transmitted the first color facsimile, separating an image into red, green, and blue components, and sending each one across the wire. Then, on the 1st of January, 1935, the Associated Press launched wire photo. 47 newspapers in 25 states received an aerial photograph of a plane crash in upstate New York, transmitted across 10,000 miles of leased telephone wire. Each print took between 10 and 17 minutes, depending on its size. The old way had taken up to 85 hours by courier. Wire photo turned the fax machine into the nervous system of American news photography. But the machines remained enormous, expensive, and locked inside newsrooms and government buildings. There were roughly 100 fax machines in the entire United States in 1933. By the late 1940s, Western Union had introduced its desk fax, a more compact unit designed for office use, and eventually manufactured over 40,000 of them. The desk fax was cheaper and smaller, but it only worked on Western Union's own network. A business in Chicago with a desk fax could reach another Western Union machine in New York, but not a military unit in Tokyo built by NEC, and not a newsroom in London running an AP system. Every manufacturer spoke a different electrical language. The fax machine had the technology, but not the network. The breakthrough that changed everything came in 2 stages, separated by 16 years and 12,000 miles. The first was from Xerox. In 1964, the company introduced the LDX for long-distance xerography. It weighed roughly 1,100 pounds, leased for $800 a month, and could process 8 pages in a minute. It was an engineering achievement and a commercial curiosity. Most offices would need to clear a small room to hold it. Then, in 1966, Xerox shipped the Magnafax telecopier. It weighed 46 pounds. It rented for $50 a month, $35 for the unit, plus $15 for a minimum usage charge, covering about 5 pages per business day. Most importantly, it could plug into any standard telephone line. A letter-sized document crossed the wire in roughly 6 minutes. For the first time, a business did not need a dedicated telegraph circuit or a proprietary network to send a fax. It needed a phone jack and a desk. The contrast in numbers tells the story of what Xerox achieved. 1,100 pounds became 46. $800 a month became 50. But even at $50 a month, adoption was stubborn. By 1970, there were only about 25,000 fax machines in the entire United States. The problem was compatibility. A Xerox machine could talk to another Xerox machine, but not to a machine built by Ricoh, or NEC, or Sharp. Every manufacturer used its own encoding, its own transmission speed, its own paper size. Buying a fax machine was useful only if the person you needed to reach owned the same brand. The technology was ready. The standard was not. The fix arrived in 1980, when the International Telecommunication Union approved the Group 3 standard. G3 specified a common digital compression method and a transmission speed of 9,600 bits per second. Any G3 machine could now talk to any other G3 machine, regardless of who built it. The standard cut transmission time from 6 minutes per page to under 1 minute. It was the single decision that turned the fax machine from a specialized office tool into a universal appliance. 2 years later, in 1982, a computer scientist published the specification for something called the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. One of those inventions would put a fax machine in every office in the world. The other would spend the next 4 decades trying to take it out. But in 1980, nobody was thinking about electronic mail. They were thinking about Japan. Japanese manufacturers had been building fax machines for decades. NEC had produced its first facsimile system as early as 1928, developed by engineers Yasujiro Niwa and Masatsugu Kobayashi. But Japanese companies had been held back by the same compatibility problem as everyone else. The G3 standard unlocked them. Within 3 years, Canon, Sharp, Ricoh, Panasonic, and Brother were shipping G3 machines that were smaller, cheaper, and more reliable than anything American or European manufacturers had produced. By 1983, over 100,000 fax machines were sold in a single year. By 1986, annual sales had doubled from that figure. The Japanese manufacturers did not invent the fax machine, but they industrialized it. The price crashed. Through the 1970s, a fax machine cost several $1,000s. By the mid-1980s, the price had fallen below $500. By the end of the decade, machines were available for under $200. The network effect did the rest. A fax machine was useful only if other people had fax machines. As the price dropped, more people bought one, which made the existing ones more useful, which drove the price down further. In 1970, there were 25,000 fax machines in the United States. By 1980, 250,000. By 1985, 500,000. By 1989, over 4 million. By 1990, 5 million. In 1987, Canon introduced the first plain paper fax machine, eliminating the curling, fading thermal paper that had been the format's most persistent annoyance. The fax machine was no longer a specialized device, it was office furniture. The numbers alone do not explain what the fax machine became during its golden age in the late 1980s and early 1990s. It changed the rhythm of business, a contract negotiation that once required days of mail and counter-signatures could close in an afternoon. An architect could send revised blueprints to a construction site across the country between lunch and the end of the working day. A doctor could fax a prescription to a pharmacy in minutes. The sound of a fax machine receiving a document, the electronic screech of two modems negotiating a handshake, followed by the slow emergence of paper from the slot, became one of the defining sounds of office life. It carried the contract that closed the deal. It carried the prescription that filled the bottle. It carried the blueprints that raised the building and the court orders that stopped the demolition and the news photographs that filled the morning papers. Two machines from this era deserve particular attention. The Xerox MagnaFax telecopier, launched in 1966, was the device that proved fax could work over an ordinary telephone line. At 46 pounds, it was light enough for a single person to carry, a meaningful fact when its predecessor weighed over half a ton. The monthly rental of $50 put it within reach of a mid-sized business, and Xerox's marketing pushed the word fax into everyday language. The MagnaFax did not transmit quickly by later standards, needing 6 minutes for a single page, but it did something no previous machine had done. It made the fax machine portable, affordable, and independent of dedicated telegraph networks. An office that could afford a telephone could now afford a fax. The second was less a single model than a generation. The Japanese G3 machines of the mid-1980s, built by Canon, Sharp, Ricoh, and others, turned the fax from an office luxury into a household appliance, particularly in Japan itself. Where American offices treated the fax as a business tool, Japanese homes adopted it for personal communication. Fax machines appeared in living rooms and kitchens. Families sent handwritten notes and drawings to relatives across the country. The Japanese writing system, with its thousands of characters that resisted the limitations of early computer keyboards, made fax a natural fit. You could write a letter by hand, feed it into the machine, and the person on the other end received your handwriting, your character, the specific pressure of your pen. In Japan, the fax was not just a document machine. It was personal. At the peak, in 1997, fax machine sales in the United States reached their highest point. In Japan, the peak came in 2000. Nearly all the machines sold during this period were manufactured in Japan. American and European companies had largely ceded the hardware market. The fax machine had become, in practical terms, a Japanese product running on an international standard, installed in offices and homes from Tokyo to Toronto. But the seed of the transition had already been planted years before the peak, and it had been growing quietly in university computer labs and technology companies. In 1982, the same year the fax market began its climb, The simple mail transfer protocol made it possible to send a text message from one computer to another across a network. In 1992, the MIME standard allowed email to carry attachments, including images and documents. The personal computer, which had been a hobbyist curiosity in the early 1980s, was now a fixture on desks around the world. In 1991, there were roughly 130 million personal computers worldwide. By 2004, 775 million. Email accounts multiplied faster than fax lines ever had. The prediction was unanimous. The fax machine was dead. Every technology analyst, every business consultant, every magazine cover story about the digital future said the same thing. Email was faster, cheaper, and could reach anyone with a computer. Why would anyone keep feeding paper into a screeching machine connected to a telephone line? Federal Express had bet $320 million on a version of this prediction and lost. In 1984, FedEx launched Zapmail, a service that promised to deliver a faxed document anywhere in the country within 2 hours. The service charged $35 for 10 pages, later reduced to 10. FedEx installed proprietary fax machines at high-volume client sites and ran a network of couriers and relay stations. The problem was that Zapmail's machines did not conform to the ITU standard. They could not communicate with the G3 machines that were flooding the market at ever lower prices. Customers discovered it was cheaper to buy their own fax machine for a few $100s than to pay FedEx $10 every time they needed to send a document. Privacy was another concern. FedEx employees handled the documents at relay stations, and businesses sending contracts or financial records did not want third parties reading them. By October of 1986, Zapmail was dead, and FedEx wrote off $320 million in losses. The fax machine had killed the service built to monetize it. But the fax machine did not die when email arrived either. It did something stranger. It endured. Not through technological superiority, but through something older and harder to engineer: trust. A fax arrives as a physical page. It can be signed, stamped, filed in a cabinet. In many legal systems, a faxed signature carries legal weight that an email attachment does not. In the United States, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, known as HIPAA, created strict rules around the transmission of medical records. And for years, the easiest way to comply was to use a fax machine, which transmitted directly between two known phone numbers without passing through the open architecture of email servers. Roughly 89% of American healthcare organizations still use fax machines. More than 9 billion fax pages are exchanged annually in United States healthcare alone. Hospitals, clinics, pharmacies, and insurance companies send referrals, test results, prescriptions, and authorization forms by fax every day. Not because the technology is superior, but because the regulatory and institutional architecture was built around it. And rebuilding that architecture is slower and more expensive than maintaining the machines. The pattern repeats across industries. Roughly 85% of United States government agencies still use fax. In Germany, 82% of companies with 20 or more employees reported fax usage. Globally, the fax services market was valued at $3.31 billion in 2024, and it is projected to reach $4.47 billion by 2030. The hardware market is declining, losing roughly 5% a year, but the service market is growing because fax itself has migrated. It now runs through the internet, transmitted as data packets between servers using the T38 protocol approved by the ITU in 1998, arriving not on thermal paper, but in a digital inbox that still calls itself a fax. The machine is disappearing. The function is not. In Japan, the persistence is cultural as well as institutional. Fax machines are available at over 81% of all convenience stores. A 2022 report by Nikkei Asia found that over 90% of Japanese local governments still used fax machines for daily communication. During the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Japanese Ministry of Health received case reports by fax and the resulting delays and data errors became a national embarrassment. Berlin experienced the same problem. Some districts reported 0 cases, not because there were none, but because the fax-based reporting system could not keep up. The pandemic did not kill the fax machine. It exposed how deeply the fax machine was embedded in the systems the world relied on. In the United Kingdom, a 2018 survey found that the National Health Service operated at least 11,620 fax machines. The NHS was, by some accounts, the world's largest purchaser of fax machines at the time. In December of that year, the health secretary announced a ban on new fax machine purchases, with a deadline of March 2020 to phase them out entirely. The directive was issued, the deadline passed, and in many NHS facilities, the fax machines kept running because the replacement systems were not yet in place. The verdict of the people who use these machines is clear enough. They do not use fax because they love the technology. They use it because they do not yet trust the alternative. A faxed document arrives at a specific number to a specific machine and produces a physical record. An email can be spoofed, filtered, lost in a spam folder, forwarded without the sender's knowledge, or intercepted on a server the sender has never heard of. For a doctor sending a patient's lab results, for a lawyer filing a court order, for a government clerk transmitting a classified memo, the fax machine offers something that email still struggles to match: certainty of delivery and a paper trail you can hold. The Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History holds a GammaFax computer fax board, built by a company called GammaLink, founded by an engineer named Hank Magnuski. In 1985, Magnuski produced the first device that could send and receive faxes directly from a personal computer, without printing a page first. His name rarely appears in popular histories of the fax machine, but the GammaFax was the bridge between the analog fax era and the digital one. The step that eventually led to internet fax services, fax apps, and the cloud-based systems that transmit billions of pages without a single sheet of paper passing through a machine. The Smithsonian also holds another fax machine, cataloged as Object 2002.0238.17. It is crushed almost beyond recognition, recovered during the September 11th recovery operation at Fresh Kills on Staten Island. A fax machine from an office in the World Trade Center, compressed into a shape no larger than a shoebox. It is not on public display, but it is there in the archive because someone at the museum understood that this machine belonged to the record of what was lost and what endured. In 2016, 139 years after his death, Alexander Bain received a Technology and Engineering Emmy Award for his pioneering work in the transmission of images. The statuette sits in Kirkintilloch Town Hall, in the Scottish town where Bain spent his final years on a pension of £80. A pub in Wick, near the village where he was born, bears his name. These are modest honors for the man who first imagined sending a page through a wire, but they are more than he received in his lifetime. Bain died before the telephone. He died before the light bulb. He never saw a fax machine that worked reliably, never saw a photograph cross a wire, never imagined a world where 9 billion pages a year would move through the system he had sketched with a pendulum and a strip of chemically treated paper. That pendulum is still swinging. Not in a London workshop, not in iron and brass, but in the principle it established. Scanning a surface, converting its pattern into a signal, sending that signal across a distance, and reassembling the document on the other side. Every fax machine humming in a hospital basement in Houston. Every cloud fax server routing a prescription through T38 packets. Every convenience store machine in Tokyo printing a handwritten note from a grandmother to a grandchild across 400 kilometers of fiber optic cable is still doing exactly what Bain described in patent number 9745, line by line. The document assembles itself at a distance. The fax machine was born before the telephone, outlived the internet, and refuses to die because the world never stopped needing a piece of paper it could trust. If you remember the sound of a fax machine picking up, the screech of the handshake, the slow curl of thermal paper emerging from the slot. Or if you still use one every day in a hospital, or a law office, or a Tokyo convenience store, drop a comment below. Tell us the year, the machine, and whether the world would be better or worse without it. The people who use these machines know more about what endured than the people who predicted their death.